The white walls of Minas Tirith stood defiant against the horizon, but the air grew thick with the stench of smoke and distant drums. Pippin clutched the stone parapet, his eyes straining to make out the endless columns of orcs and trolls marching from the plains below. Shadows lengthened across the Pelennor fields as the sun sank behind veils of ash. He had never felt so small, so utterly alone in the face of such malice. Gandalf moved among the defenders like a beacon in the gloom. His staff glowed faintly, and his voice rang out clear and commanding as he urged the men of Gondor to hold their posts.
Steady now.
He called to a weary captain near the gate.
The walls have withstood worse than this rabble.
Archers notched arrows along the battlements, their hands trembling yet ready, while catapults were wheeled into position with creaks of straining wood. Pippin watched the wizard's robes swirl as he climbed higher, pausing only to lay a reassuring hand on a soldier's shoulder. The first volleys came at dusk. Stones hurled from Mordor's engines slammed against the outer walls, sending chips of white stone flying like sparks. Pippin ducked instinctively, his breath catching as a troll bellowed from the siege lines and swung a massive hammer at the gates. "They will break through soon enough," whisper, he thought, though he dared not say it aloud. Gandalf's light flared brighter in response, pushing back the encroaching dark for a moment and heartening those nearby. Defenders poured boiling oil from the heights, and screams rose from below as the assault faltered briefly. Darkness thickened like a living thing, swallowing the last traces of daylight. Nazgul wheeled overhead on their fell beasts, their cries piercing the air and turning brave hearts to ice. Pippin felt the weight of it pressing on his mind, whispers of despair that urged him to flee or surrender. Yet Gandalf stood unbowed atop the highest tower, staff raised as he shouted orders to the captains below.
Rally to the walls. Do not let fear claim what courage has held.
His words cut through the din, and men straightened their backs, loosing arrows with renewed purpose. The battle raged through the night in waves. Orcs swarmed ladders against the lower levels, only to be repelled by spears and falling masonry. Pippin carried messages between Gandalf and the guard rooms, his small frame darting through smoke-filled corridors where wounded soldiers lay groaning. Each step revealed more of the city's strain, cracks widening in the stone, fires licking at abandoned outworks. "Hold fast," Gandalf had told him earlier.
The king may yet return, but until then, we are the last shield of the West.
By midnight, the enemy pressed harder, with siege towers creeping forward under cover of darkness. Gandalf rallied a sortie at the main gate, his voice echoing like thunder as he led a charge that scattered the front ranks of orcs. Pippin watched from above, heart swelling at the sight of the white rider amid the fray. Yet the growing shadow overhead deepened, blotting out stars and moon alike. The wizard's light flickered against it, a lone spark in an ocean of black. As dawn threatened without breaking through, the defenders caught their breath on bloodied ramparts. Gandalf returned to Pippin's side, his face lined with exhaustion, but eyes still fierce.
The city stands yet.
He said quietly. Pippin nodded, gripping his sword hilt tighter as the next wave gathered in the distance. The defenders on the ramparts drew shallow breaths as the black tide below stirred once more, yet the sound of distant horns cut through the gloom like a blade. Theoden rode at the head of his host, the riders of Rohan thundering across the Pelennor fields, with banners snapping in the wind. His voice rose above the hoofbeats, steady and commanding, urging them onward to the aid of Gondor. The king's golden hair streamed beneath his helm, and his sword gleamed as he pointed toward the besieged walls where fires still burned. Betrayal had shadowed their path even here. Word had reached them of spies and false tongues sowing doubt among the allies, whispers that the Rohirrim would never come in time. Theoden pressed on regardless, his heart hardened by years of exile and shadow. The riders crested a low ridge and beheld the full horror of the siege, the Witch King's winged shadow circling above the city like a vulture. A chill wind swept from the east, carrying the cries of the defenders and the fell laughter of orcs. Gandalf stood taller on the wall, his staff flaring brighter for a moment as he sensed the approaching aid. Pippin gripped his small sword tighter, eyes wide with sudden hope.
They have come, the wizard murmured.
Below, the Rohirrim lowered their lances and charged into the fray, horses screaming as they trampled the enemy lines. Theoden led the foremost rank, his cry ringing clear across the battlefield. The Witch King descended upon them, a figure of dread in black robes that billowed like smoke. His voice was a cold rasp that froze the blood of those who heard it. Riders faltered as the terror washed over them, some horses rearing in panic. Theoden spurred forward, undaunted, his blade flashing as he called his men to hold their ground. Betrayal struck from within the ranks when a turncoat among the scouts had weakened a flank, allowing orcs to surge through and divide the charge. The king wheeled his horse to rally the faltering riders, striking down foes with swift strokes. The air grew thick with the stench of blood and burning flesh. Theoden's riders reformed around him, their spears thrusting into the mass of enemies that pressed from every side. The Witch King's mount wheeled low, its cry piercing the din, and the Lord of the Nazgul raised a mace wreathed in shadow. Riders fell before its sweep, yet Theoden pressed closer, defiance burning in his eyes.
For Rohan and the free peoples, he shouted, the words carrying over the clash of steel.
Gandalf's light pulsed stronger from the walls, drawing the attention of the enemy for a brief span. Pippin watched in awe as the Rohirrim carved a path toward the gates, their momentum unbroken despite the losses. The betrayal's sting lingered in Theoden's mind, but he set it aside, focusing on the living foe before him. The Witch King turned its full malice upon the king, the air around them growing heavy and cold. Theoden met the gaze of his ancient enemy without flinching. His sword rose in a final arc as the riders closed in support, their horns sounding once more in triumphant sorrow. The field shook beneath the weight of the struggle, dawn still held at bay by the encroaching dark. The king's voice rang out again, steady amid the chaos, as the riders of Rohan drove deeper into the heart of the enemy host. The field still shook with the clash of steel and the thunder of hooves as the riders drove onward. Yet the king's charge could not break the endless tide alone. From the south, black sails cut through the haze of smoke and shadow. Aragorn stood at the prow of the lead ship, his eyes fixed on the distant walls of the city. The wind carried the cries of battle across the water, sharp and desperate. He had gathered the southern allies under false banners, turning the corsair fleet against its own masters. Now those same vessels bore men of Gondor and the folk of the mountains, their horns answering the call of Rohan. The river widened before them. The battle on the Pelennor lay open and terrible, a sea of dark shapes pressing against the white walls. The ships drew closer. Aragorn raised his sword high, and the men behind him answered with a shout that rolled across the water. The enemy host turned at the sound. For a moment, the orcs and their allies hesitated, uncertain what new threat approached from the river. Then the sails grew plain, and fear spread through their ranks like fire through dry grass. The first arrows flew. They fell short, splashing into the waves. Aragorn's voice carried clear over the din. He called the men forward, steady and unyielding. The ships grounded on the shore. Warriors leaped into the shallows and charged up the banks, driving into the flank of the enemy with sudden fury. The tide shifted. Riders of Rohan saw the black sails and took heart, wheeling their mounts to press the advantage. The southern men fought with the strength of those who had waited long for this hour. Gimli and Legolas stood side by side among them, axes and bows singing their own deadly song. The orcs faltered and broke in places, only to be driven back by the whips of their captains. Dawn crept nearer, Yet the darkness lingered, thick with the reek of smoke and blood. Aragorn led the charge toward the center of the field. His blade flashed in the dim light, cutting paths through the press. The allies followed, their numbers swelling the defense around the city gates. The King of Rohan's horn still sounded, but now it mingled with new calls from the river. The enemy commanders sensed the change. Fresh forces wheeled to meet the newcomers, yet their lines had already thinned. Hope, long absent, stirred in the hearts of the defenders. Men upon the walls cheered as the ships emptied and the battle lines straightened. The Pelennor no longer felt lost. Aragorn pressed onward without pause. Each step carried the weight of many miles and many promises kept. The southern allies held firm at his back, their courage rising with every fallen foe. The struggle reached its peak and began to turn, the shadow retreating before the first true light of morning. Far from the turning tide at the Pelennor, where hope had begun to kindle against the dark, Frodo and Sam moved like ghosts across the dead lands of Mordor. The ground beneath their feet was cracked and brittle, coated in a fine layer of ash that rose with every step and clung to their boots like a second skin. No grass grew here, no trees offered shade, only endless plains of stone and slag stretching toward the horizon under a sky heavy with smoke. Frodo led with the weight of the ring pulling at his neck, each breath a labor as the air grew thicker and fouler. Sam followed close, his pack slung low and his eyes scanning the wastes for any sign of pursuit. They had left the mountains behind days ago, yet the journey showed no end. The plains offered no cover, no water, nothing but the steady burn of the distant fires that marked Sauron's domain. Gollum crept somewhere in their wake. They felt him more than saw him, a skittering presence that vanished into cracks and shadows whenever they turned. His whispers reached them at night, faint and pleading, urging them forward even as he trailed behind like a hound that could not decide whether to bite or beg. Sam muttered curses under his breath whenever he caught a glimpse of those pale eyes glinting from a ridge, but Frodo said nothing. The ring had taken too much of his voice already. The eye searched without pause. It swept across the plains in great arcs, a pressure in the mind that made Frodo clutch at his throat and stagger. Each time it passed overhead, they froze, hearts hammering, until the weight lifted and they could crawl onward. The air itself seemed to watch them, heavy with the reek of burning stone and the distant roar of forges that never slept. They pressed on through the afternoon, the light never changing from its dull red haze. Frodo's steps slowed until Sam took his arm and guided him, murmuring steady words about the Shire and the road home. Water had run low again. Sam doled out the last careful sips from their skins, knowing the next spring lay far beyond sight. Hunger gnawed, but they dared not stop long enough to hunt the scrawny lizards that darted between the rocks. By evening, the plains gave way to broken ground where black boulders loomed like the bones of ancient beasts. They sheltered in the lee of one such stone, the heat radiating from it, even as the sky darkened. Frodo sat with his head bowed, the ring a constant throb against his chest. Sam watched the horizon, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword, ready for whatever might come out of the dusk. Gollum appeared at the edge of their meager camp, his thin form hunched and twitching. He brought no food but offered directions in a voice like dry leaves.
This way, yes, this way to the Dark Tower. Master must go quick, quick before the eye finds us.
Sam drove him back with a sharp word, yet the creature only withdrew to a nearby hollow, where his breathing rasped through the night like a file on metal. Sleep came fitfully. Frodo dreamed of the eye turning fully upon him, its gaze stripping away every secret and hope. He woke sweating, the taste of ash in his mouth. Sam sat vigilant, staring into the dark, and when Frodo stirred, he offered a crust of stale bread and a quiet promise that morning would bring them closer to their goal. Dawn brought no true light, only a deeper shade of grey that revealed more of the same desolation. They rose and walked again, the plains unfolding without mercy. The ground trembled now and then with the passage of distant armies, orcs moving towards some unseen muster. Frodo and Sam kept low, pressing between stones and waiting for the sound to fade before continuing. Gollum scouted ahead at times, returning with warnings of patrols or clearer paths that skirted the worst of the fumes. The eye swept again at midday, slower this time, lingering over the broken lands as if it sensed something amiss. Frodo dropped to his knees, hands pressed to his temples. Sam crouched beside him, shielding him with his body until the pressure passed. When it lifted, Frodo rose unsteadily, and they moved on, each step carrying them deeper into the shadow that still ruled these wastes. By the time they reached a shallow ravine cut through the plain, the day had worn them thin. They drank the last of their water and rested against the banks, listening to the wind that carried the far-off clang of hammers. Gollum watched from the rim above, silent for once. Frodo stared at the endless horizon, the ring heavy, and wondered how many miles still lay between them and the end of all things. Sam said nothing, only tightened his grip on his friend and waited for the next step. The path grew steeper as they left the shelter of the banks behind, each step grinding dust into their weary boots. Frodo felt the ring drag at his neck like a living chain, its whispers threading through his thoughts, even as Sam kept a steady hand on his shoulder. Gollum slithered ahead now, muttering directions that echoed faintly against the barren rocks, and the three pressed on under a sky bruised with distant smoke. Aragorn's host assembled before the Black Gate, banners snapping in the bitter wind. Riders of Rohan stood shoulder to shoulder with the men of Gondor, their armor gleaming dully under the overcast. The great doors of Mordor loomed, iron-bound and silent, until a low rumble answered their challenge. Sauron's forces poured forth in waves, orcs and trolls massing like a black tide, drawn by the presence of the king who dared defy the Dark Lord. Sam paused to share the last crumb of lembas, his voice low and steady.
Just a bit farther, Mr. Frodo. We'll find the way.
Frodo nodded, though doubt clawed at him, the ring's pull urging him to turn aside. Friendship held them together where strength alone might have faltered, each man leaning on the other as the slopes of Mount Doom drew nearer through the haze. Gollum watched with narrowed eyes, his loyalty a fragile thread ready to snap. At the gate, Aragorn raised his sword and called out, his words ringing clear across the plain. The enemy answered with horns and drums, the earth trembling under their advance. Yet the army held its line, buying precious time for the unseen quest beyond the mountains. Spears clashed and arrows flew as the confrontation unfolded, every soldier knowing their stand might tip the balance of the world. The hobbits climbed higher, the air thickening with ash that stung their lungs. Frodo stumbled, and Sam caught him without a word, hoisting him onward, even as his own legs trembled.
Lean on me.
Sam murmured, the bond between them tested by exhaustion and the ring's growing malice. A shadow crossed Gollum's face as he led them around a fissure, his mutters growing sharper.
Precious will be ours soon.
The words hung like a warning, but Sam tightened his grip and refused to let fear divide them. Back at the gate, the battle swelled. Aragorn's forces pushed forward in disciplined ranks, drawing Sauron's gaze and wrath away from the distant peaks. Horns blared, horses charged, and the clash of steel filled the air with desperate resolve. For a moment the line wavered under the weight of trolls, yet courage renewed it, each warrior fighting not for glory, but for the faint hope carried by two small figures miles away. Frodo and Sam reached a ledge overlooking the fiery slopes, the heat rising in waves that blurred their vision. The ring burned against Frodo's chest, its temptation whispering of power and rest. Sam saw the struggle in his friend's eyes and spoke plainly, his voice carrying the weight of all their shared trials.
We're in this together to the end.
The words bridged the widening gap that weariness and fear had carved, renewing their steps toward the cracks of doom. Gollum trailed behind, silent once more, as the final test of their fellowship loomed in the smoke. The confrontation at the gate raged on, a storm of arrows and blades that held the enemy's attention fixed. Aragorn's stand bought hours, perhaps days, for the quest that mattered most. In the ash-choked lands beyond, two hobbits walked the last miles side by side, their friendship forged anew against the darkness that sought to sunder it. The final test of their fellowship loomed in the smoke. Frodo and Sam pressed on through the choking fumes, each step heavier than the last, their feet sinking into the ashen slopes that rose toward the fiery heart of Mount Doom. The air burned their lungs and stung their eyes, yet they moved together, bound by a bond that had outlasted every hardship. Sam supported his friend when the ring's pull grew too strong, whispering words of encouragement that cut through the roar of distant eruptions. The ground trembled beneath them as they climbed higher, the path narrowing to a ledge above the churning lava. Frodo's face was drawn and pale, his hand clutched at his breast where the chain hung heavy. Memories of the Shire flickered through his mind like distant stars, but the ring whispered louder, promising power and escape from pain. Sam urged him forward, his own strength fading, until at last they reached the threshold of the crack of doom. There, Gollum appeared once more, a twisted shadow leaping from the rocks with eyes gleaming with hunger. The creature had tracked them through the wastes, driven by the same madness that had once claimed the ring as his own. A desperate struggle followed on the narrow brink, limbs flailing amid sparks and heat. Frodo wavered at the edge, the ring's voice overwhelming him at last. He slipped it on his finger and declared it his form vanishing into the haze. Gollum struck without mercy, biting the finger free in a savage lunge. The ring tumbled from his grasp into the molten depths below, and with a final shriek, the creature followed, consumed by the fire he had so long coveted. The mountain convulsed in response, its foundations shattering as the one ring met its end. Lava surged upward in great fountains, and the earth split with a thunder that echoed across the plains. Far away at the Black Gate, the hosts of Mordor faltered mid-battle. Aragorn's forces watched in awe as the dark tower of Barad-dûr crumbled into ruin, its foundations giving way like a tower of sand. Sauron's presence dissolved in a scream that shook the very sky, leaving his armies leaderless and broken. Orcs fled in panic or fell where they stood, their wills severed from the will that had bound them. The confrontation turned in an instant, arrows falling harmless as the enemy scattered into the wastes. Rescue came swiftly for the hobbits. Great eagles, summoned by the wizard Gandalf, swept down through the smoke to bear Frodo and Sam from the erupting peak. They awoke days later in the fields of Ithilien, their wounds tended and their burdens lifted. Word spread of the ring-bearer's triumph, and the shadow that had gripped Middle-earth for so long began to lift like mist before the dawn. Aragorn led his companions back through the liberated lands, his path now clear toward the ancient city of Minas Tirith. The people of Gondor lined the streets to greet him, banners unfurling in the wind that carried the scent of spring. He approached the throne room where the stewards had long held vigil, and there he was crowned with the ancient diadem, its white gems catching the light of renewed hope. The crowd roared its acclaim, voices rising in songs that had not been sung since the days of the old kings. Celebrations spread through the realm like wildfire, taverns filled with laughter and feasting, markets overflowed with goods once hoarded in fear, and fields were tilled anew under clear skies. Elves and dwarves mingled with men in councils of peace, their old grudges set aside. Frodo and Sam stood among the honored guests at the coronation feast, their simple presence a reminder of the courage that had saved them all. Peace settled over Middle-earth in the months that followed. Aragorn ruled with wisdom and mercy, restoring the borders and rebuilding what war had broken. The hobbits returned at last to the Shire, their hearts lighter, though Frodo carried scars that time could not fully mend. Yet in the quiet evenings by the fire, tales of the quest endured, binding friends and strangers alike in the knowledge that darkness, no matter how vast, could be overcome by the steadfast few.